Hi, Misha here, and I have a lesser known Soviet aircraft, and this is not a typical model type I would show. It's a much smaller scale and a much more less detailed model, but I really wanted to get a model of the Soviet Yak-38 Forger. This was Russia's first fixed-wing carrier-based aircraft and first production VTOL or VTOL aircraft. And this is about a 1/100 scale model. It is die-cast still from De Agostini. And for comparison, I brought out another roughly 1/100 scale from Corgi. This is of a Harrier GR3. So it would have been the Harrier fielded around the same time as the Forger. And this is from Corgi's Showcase collection, which is not officially scaled, but just by comparing the two, they seem to be pretty close when you compare things like canopy. The Yak-38 is a very interesting story. It really dates back to even before World War II, as a lot of the other powers were starting to develop carriers. In particular, Japan, because of the Russo-Japanese War. There was a debate within Russia in the 1920s and 30s as to if Russia would get a carrier, would go that route. Russia had been a large navy, if not necessarily the best or most modern navy, before World War I and into World War I. But after the war, they really saw it downsized, and this is really when they would turn to the submarine fleet, which they would pursue throughout the Cold War era. Well, quite importantly, Stalin was not really convinced of the efficacy of carriers, and then Operation Barbarossa, it was just not really seen as something Russia needed at the time, so it didn't get a lot of attention or traction. However, during the Korean War, Russia noticed how effective American and British aircraft carriers were, especially at helping launch strike missions into Korea. In places where aircraft could not have land bases, they could just station a carrier off the coast and send over a plane with a few 500-pound bombs or a bunch of rockets and do their thing. So this kind of got the discussion up and running about carriers again, and Stalin was starting to kind of come around in the early 50s. And then he died. His replacement, Nikita Khrushchev, was not really a fan of naval affairs. He was more into the bomber camp, and also he found rocketry, which Russia had been experimenting with since the early 30s. And they even had some functional rocketry prototypes, like the BI-1 through BI-9, during World War II. He promoted rocketry. He also promoted the bomber force, like the T-95. So, not much happened. However, Russia was experimenting with short takeoff and landings thanks to rocket-assisted. Essentially, they would strap on some rockets to, say, like a MiG-19 and later MiG-21, and they would have them able to be scrambled at a moment's notice to intercept American reconnaissance and British reconnaissance planes, for example, the U-2. So they were a fan of short takeoff and landing. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis once again showed Russia how helpful the U.S. found having a carrier force. So once more, and then the Vietnam War, And of course, America uses carriers throughout. So by the late 60s, short takeoff and vertical takeoff and landing was at the forefront, and there was a big push in the Politburo to fund the development of some kind of smaller scale carrier. Well, in 1967, the predecessor to this aircraft, known as the Yak-38 Freehand, was first shown. Now, the Yak-38 was basically a tech demonstrator. It never went into full production. It was land-based. It was capable of vertical takeoff and landing, but because of all the complicated systems, it really didn't have much in the way of endurance or leftover capacity to haul weapons. But it did show potential there. And the Yakovlev Design Bureau, who had become famous in World War II for such planes as the Yak-3, had kind of fallen behind and fallen out of the limelight during the jet age, with Mikoyan, MiG, and Sukhoi Su really taking charge. And so Yakovlev really saw this as an opportunity to make a niche for his bureau and began pushing to make a new fighter for a new class of heavy aircraft carrying cruiser that Russia decided to build, which they would lay down on 1970. This would ended up becoming the Kiev class. Interesting ship. It was classified as a heavy cruiser, so it could go through Turkish waters without problem. Carriers were not allowed. It was between 40 and 45,000 tons. And not only could it carry an air group, it also had a large naval cannon. It had surface-to-surface missiles as well as surface-to-air missiles. And it was reasonably fast for that day and time, 36, 37 miles per hour. So the carrier is being constructed, and therefore working with the Yak-38, the first prototype of the Yak-38M was finished in late 1970. It would first take to the air in January of 1971. It would undergo test flights and operational readiness and pretty much be ready to go by 1974-1975. Now, the Yak-36M was the pre-production model. While it was based on the 36, it was quite different. The Yak-38, though, would become the full production model. The Kiev was ready in December of 1975, and then in July of 1976, it was made known to the world, and it, along with its aircraft, were put into operational readiness, at least on paper, in August of that year. It could carry 20 now named Yak-38, although it would usually just carry 12, so it had extra leftover room for helicopters and whatnot. So what do we have here? Well, the NATO reporting name is Forger. And this might look somewhat like a Harrier. But really, it's not. It has a vectorable thrust engine in the rear, much like the modern F-35B. And it has two smaller power engines in the front, which are only used for the vertical takeoff or short takeoff and landing roles. The standard Forger A was a single-seat naval strike fighter. The Forger B, also known as in Russia as the Yak-38U, was a two-seat trainer. It's longer than a Harrier. It's about 54 feet long, whereas a Harrier is around 47 feet. but it has a smaller wing, right at 24 feet, whereas the Harrier's wing is about 26 to 29 feet, depending on if it has the additional fuel tanks. Whereas a Harrier is capable of about 730 miles per hour, at least this version here. The Yak, they originally considered trying to go to make it supersonic, but they scaled it back. Maximum speed was right around the speed of sound, right around 800 miles per hour. It's been reported it has been tracked at going supersonic at just barely, but either way, we'll call it transonic. That's probably the fairest. Max altitude is between 35 and 40,000 feet, depending on payload. And yeah, these started to go into production and service in 1976. The second Kiev-class carrier, Minsk, was launched in 1979, followed by a third and a fourth in the class in the 1980s. Probably the most famous incident happened in 1982 when armed Yak-38s intercepted F-14s flying from USS Enterprise. This marked the first time that Russian fixed-wing naval-based aircraft with weapons intercepted armed American naval aircraft. Obviously nothing happened. They just did a little flyby, but it was psychologically significant. And at a time when the Cold War was a little on the hot side. Not as hot as it had been in the past, but it was a little warmer in the early 80s than it had been at some points in the 70s. These planes were also in service during Afghanistan period and were occasionally used for strike missions here and there. And in 1983, they actually tested these, not just operating from the Kiev class, but also operating from the decks of some merchantman civilian ships. And that kind of gets us to the Yak-38. Had some very good and some very bad attributes. The good. This was a true VTOL capable aircraft. It could vertically take off and vertically land, meaning it could take off and use helicopter pads. Meaning it could be very flexible, very versatile. As I said, it was faster than the Harrier. And it gave Russia a carrier presence. Something they'd never had before. After a 50-year debate, they finally had a carrier capable of launching a dozen or more aircraft, which projected their force in the world. The plane was used not only for interception, it was also used for anti-submarine warfare. And interestingly, as I said, the Kiev class had surface-to-surface missiles, cruise missiles. The Yak-38 could be used to help guide these missiles while they were in flight. So as they left the immediate airspace of the cruiser carrier, these could be further out and report on the trajectory and give feedback to help it hit its target. It also confirm hits and other reconnaissance type duties. The Yak really was a lot of firsts for Russia, and it was a good response to the Harrier, because keep in mind, by the 70s and 80s, not only Britain was fielding the Harrier, but also the U.S. Marine Corps. So it really showed that Russia wasn't that far behind on technology. But this plane was a compromise. While it was faster than the Harrier, it had a shorter range. It had less endurance. It could carry a smaller payload. The earliest Harriers could carry around 5,000 pounds. The Yak-38 could carry around 4,400 pounds. It had 4 underwing hardpoints. It could carry air-to-air missiles, air-to-surface guided missiles, rockets, or even unguided bombs. Or it could be fitted with a couple of 23mm gun pods. But with its limited payload and limited endurance, this was a short-range item. And though it was fast, it was not all that maneuverable. It did not handle particularly well, so its dogfighting prowess was limited, to say the least. On top of that, its engines, unlike the Harriers, all had to work, and they were all required for takeoff and landing. So if there was an engine failure, it would abort the mission on takeoff, or on landing, the plane would be scrapped. In fact, it was so critical that if one of the engines failed at an important point, the pilot would be automatically ejected to save his life. So its incidence of failure, risk of failure, was much higher than the Harrier. And of course, once the takeoff had happened, the 2 small front engines were pretty much dead weight until landing was happening. You know, we talked about in the MiG-23 video, the Model 23-01, the Delta Wing VTOL, VSTOL, capable prototype the MiG went with. It had the same problem. Obviously, they didn't go with it. Ultimately, they decided to go to a variable geometry wing instead to achieve their goals. But with this, they didn't really have that choice because the Kiev class, while a relatively large ship, was still quite small. She had a small flight deck, and she only had 1 elevator. And even though this is a pretty short wingspan of, like I said, only about 24 feet, even then, the wings actually had to fold to fit on her elevator. So small boat, and thus a small, limited capability aircraft. Which ultimately in 1980 led to the beginning of what would become the Admiral Kuznetsov program, giving Russia a much larger carrier with the ski jump, which would lead to things like the MiG-29K and the Su-27K, which would be evolved into the Su-33, which, yes, I've done a video on. But it was an important step, and with 4 capable Kiev classes, and they weren't just carriers, they had offensive and defensive capabilities as well. It really showed that Russia was getting not just into the submarine game, but the whole surface fleet. And if nothing else, it was quite a bit cheaper than the U.S.'s supercarriers. They did develop an improved version known as the Yak-38M. It was designed in the early 80s and began to see service in 1985. It had a new set of engines, more powerful, and it could lift a larger payload, and had a few other design improvements like better, larger air intakes. But even it was still outclassed by the original generation of Harriers, and then of course the Harrier 2 series would come in, leading to things like the AV-8B and the GR5 and the full GR7, which were just infinitely better than either the original Harrier or the Yak-38. There were plans to have an even more advanced version known as the Yak-141, and it did fly at the end of the 1980s, but then of course the Soviet Union collapsed and it never went beyond the prototype stage. That, combined with the Admiral Kuznetsov class, pretty much spelled the end. So while these would fly in the 1980s, they, along with their carriers, were slated for retirement after the end of the Soviet period, going out of service around 1995. 3 of the carriers would be scrapped, although one would be sold to India who refurbished it and then put it back into service in 2013. So one Kiev class is actually still out in the world today, although I don't believe any Yak-38s are. Now, you would think this might have been something they only built a few of, kind of like the Su-33, but actually no, they built a large number, around 230, which is, I mean, that might not sound big, but look at the production numbers for the Harrier. Most of these, over 140, would be the standard Yak-38. Around 50 would be the improved Yak-38M, and the remainder would be Yak-38U trainers and a few test and prototypes like the Yak-36M. So really, it was in some ways a very technically impressive aircraft, but it was more important for what it represented for Russia. And again, it had some very major limitations, so it was very much for a specific purpose, a specific use. Whereas something like the Harrier, even early on, was more general purpose and adaptable. Which is why it was really one of the world's first, if not the first, and really one of the very few successful VTOL fighter aircraft. I'd almost say the only one, at least until the F-35B finally materialized. But yeah, that's kind of why I wanted a model of the Yak-38, even if I couldn't find a Corgi or Hobby Master. I really would prefer this in 1/72 scale, but I thought it was worth getting. It's a neat little model. I like the little Day Agostinis. They're good values. These are very inexpensive for what they are. $15. Comes with a pretty normal stand. It does have, as you see, there's some couple of missiles, and I believe they're tanks. They might be guns. No, I think they're tanks. They got fuel tanks, so one missile and one fuel tank under each wing. It does have the pitot tube. It does have a cockpit. It's not just painted, it actually is a piece of plastic. I assume clear, but it's different. The main body and the tail are metal. And the wings are polymer. Plastic. And I imagine that's because of how thin they are. It might be hard to make these in metal and not have them warped during the manufacturing process. Good stand though. Nice and wide, and it plugs in very, very tight, very secure, so it's not going to come off. I like that. The Corgi is kind of the opposite. The stand is pretty meh. And it does not have the tube in the front. Just how they make it. It does have a piece of clear plastic for the cockpit though. And this is all metal. So it does have some weight to it. So it is a heavier aircraft, but it doesn't have really any ordnance to speak of under the wings. So for weight, the Corgi is nice, but I'd say the D'Agostini maybe has a little better detail. Plus it has the weapons, and it has a nicer stand. But they're both around $15 models. Yeah, just pick this up to have it. If a 1/72 scale Forger ever comes along, I will definitely pick it up because it's a really neat part of Soviet aviation history. And besides, there aren't that many Yaks to be had post World War II. And I just had this little GR3. Figured why not. Have this thing for Harriers. And it's just a neat little mess around model. Alright. Alrighty, folks, I hope you found this interesting. If you didn't know about the Yak-38, well, now you do, and if you did, hope I did an okay job of presenting the Forger to you. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Otherwise, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.